May 2nd, 2011. The night the world believed it ended. The compound in Abbottabad, the helicopters descending through darkness, the raid that was supposed to close a chapter written in smoke and ash and the falling towers of September. But history, sometimes, refuses to follow the script we've written for it. In this telling, he does not fall. The bullets do not find him. Through chance, through circumstance, through the inexplicable turns that time occasionally takes, Osama bin Laden survives, and the war that bore his name continues. Not as it was, but as something stranger, more complex, woven through decades that stretch forward from that moment into our present day. This is not the story of his death. This is the story of what happens when death does not come, when the symbol remains flesh, when the ghost becomes a living shadow moving through a world that thought it had seen the end of him. Close your eyes now and drift backward to that compound, to that night, to the moment when everything should have concluded, but did not. The helicopter blades beat against Pakistani air, creating rhythms that should have been the drum roll to conclusion. Inside the compound, the figure who had shaped the nightmares of nations moved through rooms he had occupied for years, hidden in plain sight, protected by walls and silence and the strange luck that had carried him through decades of pursuit. The SEAL team breached the outer walls, moved through corridors with practiced precision, their night vision turning darkness into green certainty. They were coming for the man who had orchestrated September 11th, who had declared war on the West from mountain caves, who had become the most wanted human being on Earth. But in this timeline, something shifts. Perhaps a warning arrives seconds earlier. Perhaps he moves to a different room. Perhaps the universe, in its infinite complexity, simply spins a different way. The operation unfolds, and he is not there. Or he is there, but unreachable. The compound yields evidence, intelligence, the detritus of a hidden life, but not the man himself. The helicopters lift away. The night concludes, and somewhere in the labyrinth of safe houses and secret networks that had protected him for so long, Osama bin Laden remains alive. The announcement never comes. There is no presidential address, no crowds gathering outside the White House chanting in relief and celebration, no sense of closure for the thousands who lost loved ones in the towers, in the Pentagon, in the Pennsylvania field where Flight 93 fell from the sky. Instead, there is continued searching, continued vigilance, the war on terror grinding forward without its symbolic conclusion. And bin Laden recedes deeper into shadow. He had already spent a decade in hiding, had already transformed from battlefield commander to phantom, from the man who walked openly in Sudan and Afghanistan to the fugitive who communicated through couriers and encrypted messages. Now, after the Abbottabad raid that nearly succeeded, he becomes even more careful, even more isolated, moving through a network that contracts around him like a closing fist. The years that follow are years of silence. Al-Qaeda continues its operations, continues to metastasize into franchises and affiliates spreading across continents, but bin Laden himself becomes myth within myth, a rumor even among jihadists, a name whispered but rarely confirmed. By 2013, the world has moved on in the way that worlds do, attention shifting to new crises, new conflicts, the civil war tearing through Syria, the rise of new militant groups who carry his ideology forward but no longer need his direct command. He watches this, perhaps from rooms in Waziristan or hidden compounds in the tribal areas, watches as the movement he helped create evolves beyond him, becomes something he no longer fully controls. There is an irony in this, that the longer he lives, the less relevant he becomes to the very war that bears his conceptual fingerprints. ISIS rises in 2014, declaring a caliphate, employing brutality that makes even Al-Qaeda uncomfortable, and there are reports, unconfirmed, whispered through intelligence channels, that bin Laden himself has criticized their methods, has sent messages through intermediaries suggesting restraint. But who listens to ghosts? Who heeds the guidance of a man who cannot show his face, who cannot appear in videos, who has become more symbol than leader? His survival, paradoxically, has made him less powerful. Had he died in Abbottabad, he would have been martyred, his image frozen in time, his legend complete. Living, he must contend with irrelevance, with the movement outgrowing him, with history continuing without waiting for his approval. 2015 arrives, and with it the refugee crisis that floods Europe with hundreds of thousands fleeing the wars in Syria and Iraq, fleeing the violence that can be traced, in part, to the ideologies and conflicts he helped ignite years before. Does he see the connection? Does he understand that September 11th was not just an attack but a seed that grew into forests of consequence, into the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, the destabilization that rippled outward through the Middle East like seismic waves that never quite settle? He had wanted to provoke the United States, to draw them into unwinnable wars that would bleed their economy and expose their empire. And in some ways, he succeeded. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq cost trillions, exhausted American power, killed hundreds of thousands, created the conditions for new extremism to flourish. But the cost to the Muslim world, the destruction of cities, the deaths of civilians in numbers that dwarf the casualties of September 11th. Was this part of his vision? Or has his immortality forced him to witness the full consequences of his actions, to see not just the tactical victories, but the oceans of suffering that flowed from the moment those planes struck the towers? By 2016, he is 64 years old, an age when most men begin to slow, to reflect, to feel the weight of years in their bones. But bin Laden cannot slow, cannot appear publicly, cannot move freely. If he suffers from the kidney disease that plagued him in the early 2000s, he treats it in secret, relying on doctors who come in darkness and ask no questions. His hair, once dark, has long since turned white. His body, once that of a man who trekked through Afghan mountains, has weakened. But his mind remains sharp, remains engaged with the movements of the world, with the continued unfolding of the conflicts he helped create. The American election of 2016 brings Donald Trump to power, a candidate who campaigned on banning Muslims, on intensifying the war on terror, on being even more aggressive than his predecessors. Does bin Laden watch this development with satisfaction, seeing the West turn inward, seeing the divisions deepen? Or does he recognize that the civilization he sought to damage has instead damaged itself, has consumed its own principles in the fight against him, and that perhaps this was always the real victory, not the destruction of buildings but the erosion of the values those buildings represented? The world of 2017 and 2018 is a world that has forgotten him in the daily noise of existence, but has not forgotten the world he helped create. Terror attacks continue. Manchester, Barcelona, Istanbul, attacks that invoke his ideology even if they do not invoke his name. Al-Qaeda persists in Yemen, in Somalia, in North Africa, franchises that operate with increasing independence. He is the founder of an organization that has become a network, a philosophy, a methodology that no longer requires his active leadership to perpetuate itself. This too is a kind of immortality, the immortality of ideas that outlive their originators. But it is not the immortality of flesh, and flesh is what he possesses, flesh that ages and hides and moves through the years with the burden of continued existence. Intelligence agencies continue to search, though with less intensity than in the years immediately following September 11th. Resources shift to newer threats. ISIS, cyber warfare, the rise of China, the resurgence of Russia. Bin Laden becomes a cold case that remains technically open, a file that analysts review periodically but no longer pursue with the fervor of the early 2000s. There are occasional reports, a sighting in the tribal areas, a communication intercepted, but nothing confirmed, nothing solid enough to launch another raid. By 2019, nearly 2 decades have passed since September 11th, and a generation has grown up for whom the towers falling is history, not memory, something they learned about in school rather than experienced in real time. The war in Afghanistan continues, America's longest war, grinding through its 18th year with no clear endpoint, no clear victory, a conflict that has become routine, normalized, a permanent state of low-intensity warfare that most Americans no longer think about. Is this what he wanted? A forever war that exhausts empires? Or has the war simply become pointless, a bureaucratic perpetuation of itself, continuing because it has always continued, because no one knows how to stop? Bin Laden, if he is still capable of strategic thought, if he is still connected enough to receive information about the state of the world, might recognize that he has achieved a strange kind of success. Not the overthrow of the West, not the establishment of a caliphate, but something subtler, the transformation of Western societies into security states, the normalization of surveillance, the erosion of civil liberties, the endless expenditure of resources on a war without clear boundaries or end conditions. He wanted to make the United States bleed. And in the bleeding, something has changed, something has hardened or perhaps dissolved, and the country that went to war in 2001 is not quite the same country that continues fighting in 2019. Then comes 2020, and with it a pandemic that reshapes the world in ways no terrorist attack could ever accomplish. COVID-19 spreads from Wuhan across continents, shutting down economies, killing millions, forcing entire populations into isolation. Bin Laden, wherever he is hidden, must shelter not just from the drones and special forces that have hunted him for decades, but from a virus that respects neither ideology nor power. The world that emerges from the pandemic is changed, more digital, more isolated, more suspicious, supply chains disrupted, trust in institutions eroded, conspiracy theories flourishing in the absence of shared reality. And the war on terror quietly fades from headlines, replaced by news of infection rates and vaccine development and political battles over masks and lockdowns. In a strange way, the virus accomplishes what terrorism never could. It brings Western civilization to a halt. It reveals the fragility of systems. It demonstrates that the real threats may not come from men with box cutters or truck bombs, but from invisible enemies that require no ideology or training to spread. Does Bin Laden see this? Does he understand that the world has moved beyond him, that history has found new horrors, new crises, new ways to terrify and disrupt? By 2021, he is 69 years old, an age when most men are grandparents, are retired, are reflecting on lives lived and legacies established. But his legacy is contested, is mixed, is still unfolding. In August of 2021, the United States withdraws from Afghanistan, and the Taliban, the movement that once hosted him, that provided sanctuary in the years before September 11th, sweeps back into power with stunning speed. Kabul falls. The government collapses. American helicopters evacuate the embassy in scenes that echo Saigon decades before. 20 years of war, thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of Afghan lives, trillions of dollars, and the Taliban returns to power as if the entire conflict were an expensive, tragic interlude that changed nothing and everything. If bin Laden is still alive to witness this, what does he feel? Vindication. That the empire could not hold, could not impose its will permanently, that the graveyard of empires claimed another? Or does he see the suffering of ordinary Afghans, particularly women and girls whose rights collapse overnight, and recognize that his actions, his decisions, contributed to this cycle of violence and repression? The Afghanistan withdrawal becomes the final bookend to the war on terror era, the symbolic conclusion even if the actual policies and operations continue in diminished form. Drone strikes still occur. Special forces still operate in shadows. But the grand project, the idea that terrorism could be defeated through military intervention, through nation building, through the application of overwhelming force, has been abandoned, revealed as fantasy, as hubris, as a misunderstanding of the nature of the conflicts themselves. Bin Laden's continued survival means he has witnessed the entire arc. From the attacks he planned to the wars they triggered to the ultimate withdrawal and return to something resembling the status quo before September 11th. Except nothing is the same. The United States has changed, has spent itself, has revealed limitations. The Middle East has been reshaped, borders redrawn in blood, millions displaced, nations destroyed. And terrorism has evolved, has spread, has become both more diffuse and more localized, carried forward by groups that barely remember the thin man in the cave videos who once dominated the imagination of Western intelligence. By 2022, he is 70 years old, and the world is dealing with new crises. Russia invades Ukraine, launching a conventional war in Europe that recalls the Cold War tensions that shaped bin Laden's own youth, when he was a young man fighting Soviets in Afghanistan with weapons supplied by the CIA. There is symmetry in this, perhaps, history rhyming even when it does not repeat. The war in Ukraine dominates global attention, reshapes alliances, tests the resolve of Western powers in ways that have nothing to do with terrorism and everything to do with old-fashioned territorial conquest. And bin Laden, if he is still following world events, must recognize that he is no longer the central threat, no longer the organizing principle around which Western security policy revolves. The world has moved on. New enemies have emerged. And he has become a relic, a ghost from a previous era, kept alive by circumstance but no longer driving history forward. 2023 arrives, and with it the rapid emergence of artificial intelligence, of large language models that can generate text and images, of technologies that begin to reshape labor and creativity and human interaction in ways that are just beginning to be understood. The world bin Laden inhabits, if he is still in some remote compound, is increasingly alien to the world in which he came of age, when communication meant couriers and letters, when propaganda required physical tapes mailed to Al Jazeera. The jihadist movements that carry forward his ideology now use Telegram and encrypted apps, recruit through social media, spread propaganda through platforms that did not exist when he planned September 11th. He is, in a sense, obsolete within his own movement, a man from the age of cassette tapes trying to understand the age of streaming. The tactics have evolved beyond him. The theology, the grievances, the goals, these remain, but the methods, the organizational structures, the ways in which terror is planned and executed, these have changed, have adapted to technologies he may barely understand. In Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula continues operations, but has been weakened by years of drone strikes and internal conflicts. In Syria, the remnants of ISIS persist, though the caliphate has collapsed. In Afghanistan, ISIS-K conducts attacks against the Taliban themselves, a fratricidal conflict between jihadist movements that would have been unthinkable in the years when bin Laden commanded some degree of unified respect across the spectrum of militant Islam. The fracturing, the splintering, the evolution of terrorism into 1,000 localized movements with overlapping but distinct goals. This is his legacy as much as September 11th. He helped create a methodology, a framework, a justification for violence that others have picked up and modified and used for their own purposes. And he, if he still lives, must watch this happen, must see his life's work transform into something he does not fully control, does not fully recognize, does not fully endorse. By 2024, he is 72 years old, and the United States is again in the midst of a presidential election, again debating its role in the world, again arguing over immigration and security and identity. The wars he triggered have faded from campaign rhetoric. Candidates barely mention Afghanistan. The war on terror is not a centerpiece of political debate. Instead, the focus is on domestic issues, inflation, healthcare, education, the political divisions that have deepened over decades and now threaten the basic functioning of democratic institutions. In this landscape, bin Laden is a ghost, a name from the past that occasionally surfaces in history documentaries or anniversary coverage but no longer drives policy or shapes elections. The terrorism that Americans fear now is often domestic, mass shootings, right-wing extremism, threats that emerge from within the society rather than from foreign caves or compounds. The fear has turned inward, and bin Laden, sequestered wherever he hides, aging and increasingly disconnected from the currents of a world that has moved beyond him, must contend with the possibility that his entire life's effort has been, not a failure, exactly, because the damage was real, the consequences enormous, but also not the victory he imagined. The West has not collapsed. Islam has not been united under a caliphate. The grievances he articulated, Palestine, Western military presence in the Middle East, support for dictatorial regimes, these persist, but his methods for addressing them have been discredited even among many who share his anger. The suffering he caused, the thousands who died in the towers, the thousands more who died in the wars that followed, the millions displaced, the entire generation shaped by fear and security theater and endless conflict. What did it achieve? What changed? The world is perhaps more militarized, more suspicious, more divided. But it is not the world he sought to create. It is simply a wounded version of the world that existed before, scarred by violence but not transformed by it. 2025 arrives, and we enter the present moment, the time in which this narration unfolds, the years that stretch forward into uncertainty. Bin Laden, if he has survived this long, is 73 years old, an old man by any measure, living in conditions of extreme secrecy and isolation that would break most people psychologically. He cannot travel, cannot appear publicly, cannot use modern communications without risk of detection. His world has shrunk to a series of rooms, wherever they may be, protected by loyalists who may be fewer and less capable than they once were. The networks that sustained him are eroding, compromised by decades of intelligence penetration, by the natural attrition of time, by the shifting priorities of movements that have found new leaders and new methods. He is, perhaps, a prisoner of his own survival, living only because dying would require him to emerge from hiding, to be vulnerable, to expose himself to the forces that have sought him for more than 2 decades. What does he think about, in the quiet hours? Does he pray, as he always claimed his actions were in service of God? Does he justify? Does he regret? Does he plan? Or has the isolation, the endless years of hiding, the weight of being the world's most wanted man, has this ground down his spirit, left him hollow, a shell continuing to breathe simply because breath continues? There are no videos from him now, no statements, no communications that intelligence agencies can intercept and analyze. There is only silence, and the occasional rumor, and the fading memories of what he once represented. The younger generation of jihadists may know his name, may invoke it ritually, but he is not their leader, not their inspiration in the way he was for the men who carried out September 11th. New figures have emerged, new ideologues, new operational commanders who learned from his successes and failures and moved in different directions. The world of 2025 and beyond is a world grappling with climate change, with artificial intelligence, with shifting global power dynamics as China rises and the American century draws toward its ambiguous conclusion. The war on terror, the defining conflict of the early 21st century, has become one crisis among many, has been absorbed into the broader landscape of anxiety and threat that characterizes modern existence. Terrorism still happens, attacks in mosques, in markets, in trains and buses and public squares. But it is episodic. It is terrible when it occurs, but it does not dominate the global imagination the way it did in the years immediately following September 11th. The fear has been normalized, has been incorporated into the architecture of daily life through security checkpoints and surveillance systems and the quiet assumption that public spaces are vulnerable, that safety is never absolute, that risk is permanent. And Bin Laden, the man who helped create this climate of fear, lives on in obscurity, irrelevant to the very conditions he helped establish. His survival has become its own kind of prison, his immortality not a blessing but a curse that denies him the martyrdom that would have completed his narrative, that would have allowed his followers to sanctify his memory and freeze his image at the moment of greatest symbolic power. Instead, he ages, he weakens, he continues through years that hold no triumph, no vindication, only the slow erosion of relevance and the accumulation of consequences he perhaps never fully imagined when he sat in Afghan caves planning the attacks that would reshape the world. September 11th was supposed to be the beginning of the end for American power, the provocation that would trigger the collapse of an empire and the awakening of the Muslim world. Instead, it became the beginning of a long, confused, brutal series of conflicts that damaged everyone involved, that created new forms of extremism while failing to address the underlying grievances, that militarized societies and normalized surveillance and eroded civil liberties while failing to make anyone truly safe. If he reflects, in these years of enforced contemplation, on the path that brought him from wealth and privilege in Saudi Arabia to caves in Afghanistan to whatever room he occupies now, what does he see? He was born in 1957 in Riyadh, the 17th of 52 children, son of a construction magnate who built palaces and mosques across the kingdom. He grew up in comfort, studied engineering and business, was by all accounts quiet, pious, unremarkable. But something shifted in him, some combination of religious fervor and political awakening and personal need that transformed him from a wealthy young man into a fighter, into a financier of jihad, into the most wanted terrorist in history. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was the catalyst, the event that drew him to the battlefield, where he discovered purpose and identity in the struggle against a superpower. He was not a great fighter, by most accounts, not particularly skilled in combat, but he had resources, had organizational ability, had the charisma to inspire others and the conviction to persist when others faltered. The years in Afghanistan during the 1980s were the crucible that forged Al-Qaeda, though the organization did not take that name until later, until after the Soviets had withdrawn and bin Laden began to imagine a broader struggle, a global jihad against what he saw as the corruption and oppression of the West and its client regimes in the Muslim world. The Gulf War in 1991 was another turning point, when American forces deployed to Saudi Arabia to repel Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. For bin Laden, the presence of non-Muslim troops in the land of the two holy mosques was an intolerable sacrilege, a betrayal by the Saudi royal family, and it hardened his resolve to strike at American power wherever it could be found. He was expelled from Saudi Arabia, took refuge in Sudan, then returned to Afghanistan when the Taliban offered sanctuary. And it was there, in the mountains and training camps, that September 11th was planned, that 19 men were recruited and trained and sent to America to turn passenger jets into weapons and to kill nearly 3,000 people in a single morning. He expected retaliation, expected war, but he believed the war would follow patterns he understood, would be Vietnam repeated, would be the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, foreign forces bogged down in impossible terrain, bleeding resources, and will until withdrawal became inevitable. And in some ways, he was right. The war in Afghanistan did become America's longest war, did exhaust the nation, did end in withdrawal and a return of the Taliban. But the cost was borne primarily by the people he claimed to be fighting for, the Muslims whose suffering he invoked to justify his actions. Afghanistan was devastated, Iraq was destroyed, Yemen torn apart, Somalia brutalized, Mali destabilized. The American empire was wounded, was diminished, but it survived. And the Muslim world, paid in blood and displacement and ruined cities for the provocation he unleashed. Was this the plan? Or did he miscalculate? Did he fail to imagine the full scope of retaliation? Did he assume that the suffering would somehow catalyze resistance and awakening rather than simply creating more suffering? These are questions he cannot answer publicly, cannot address except in the privacy of his own thoughts, if he still has the clarity to think them through. By his 70s, if kidney disease or other ailments have progressed, he may be in chronic pain, may be dependent on medications that are difficult to obtain, may be deteriorating in ways that make strategic thinking impossible. Or perhaps he has been fortunate in his health, has maintained his physical condition through the discipline and asceticism that always characterized his lifestyle. Either way, he is trapped by his own survival, by the decision to continue hiding rather than to emerge and face capture or martyrdom. He cannot surrender, cannot seek medical care in normal facilities, cannot move freely, cannot communicate openly. He is a man in a cage of his own making, and the walls of that cage are the consequences of every decision he made from the moment he chose violence as the answer to the questions that troubled him. The theological justifications he offered for September 11th and the attacks that preceded it, the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998 that killed hundreds, the USS Cole bombing in 2000. These were drawn from interpretations of Islam that most Muslim scholars rejected, that relied on selective readings and the privileging of certain texts over others. He declared that civilians in democratic countries were legitimate targets because they bore responsibility for the policies of their governments, a reasoning that erased the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, that made everyone a potential target, that justified mass murder as religious duty. He believed, or claimed to believe, that he was acting in defense of Islam, that the violence he unleashed was responsive violence, retaliation for the violence inflicted on Muslims by the West and its allies. But the calculus was never balanced, could never be balanced, because violence begets violence in expanding circles, and the suffering compounds rather than resolves. In the years since September 11th, there have been countless theological refutations of his ideology, countless Muslim leaders and scholars who have condemned his methods and his interpretations, who have insisted that Islam does not permit the killing of innocents, that jihad has conditions and constraints, that his actions were not heroic resistance but mass murder and sacrilege. But these voices, while numerous and sincere, have struggled to compete with the simplicity and emotional power of his narrative, the narrative of Muslim humiliation and Western oppression, the call to action, the promise of martyrdom and paradise for those who die fighting. It is easier, in some ways, to destroy than to build, easier to inspire anger than to cultivate patience, easier to offer violence as solution than to engage in the slow, difficult work of political organization and reform. And bin Laden understood this, understood the power of the spectacular act, the symbolic strike that captures attention and imagination even if it does not achieve concrete political objectives. But what are the concrete political objectives achieved by September 11th? When viewed from the perspective of 2025. Al-Qaeda still exists but is weakened and fragmented. No caliphate has been established. American military presence in the Middle East has decreased in some areas, increased in others, shifted and adapted but not disappeared. The Israel-Palestine conflict continues unresolved. Cycles of violence alternating with periods of tense calm, the underlying injustice unaddressed. Authoritarian regimes in the Muslim world, the regimes bin Laden opposed, remain in power, often more repressive than before, using the war on terror as justification for crackdowns on dissent. The Muslim world is not more united but more divided. Sectarian conflicts between Sunni and Shia, between different interpretations and movements, tearing through communities and nations. If bin Laden's goal was to awaken the Muslim world and unite it against Western hegemony, the result has been the opposite: fragmentation, weakness, internal conflict, and suffering on scales that dwarf anything inflicted by external enemies. Perhaps this is what keeps him alive, if he still lives: the need to witness, to see how the story ends, to understand what his life meant in the fullness of time. Or perhaps survival is simply habit, simply the continuation of routines established decades ago, the hiding and the silence and the waiting without clear purpose beyond the avoidance of capture. The human mind, when isolated for too long, can lose its connection to larger meanings, can contract to the immediate concerns of survival, of getting through another day, another week, another year. He may no longer think in terms of grand strategy or religious duty. He may simply exist, an old man in a room, guarded by people whose loyalty is maintained through money or ideology or fear, waiting for nothing in particular because there is nothing else to do but wait. The families of those who died on September 11th have lived their own decades in the shadow of that day, have raised children who never knew the parent who went to work that Tuesday morning and never came home, have navigated anniversaries and memorials and the complicated work of grief that never quite resolves. Some have forgiven, have found peace through faith or therapy or the passage of time. Some remain angry, remain committed to ensuring that the attacks are never forgotten, that the perpetrators and those who supported them are held accountable. And some have questioned the wars that followed, have wondered whether the response to September 11th created more harm than healing, whether the trillions spent and the lives lost in Iraq and Afghanistan truly honored the dead or simply added to the body count. If bin Laden knows that these debates exist, if he has access to information about the long-term consequences of his actions, does he care? Does he recognize the humanity of those he killed? Or has his ideology so completely dehumanized the enemy that their deaths remain, for him, abstract, justified, necessary? One of the great questions about violent extremism is whether it is driven by belief or by other factors, by trauma, by humiliation, by the desire for significance, by psychological needs dressed in religious language. Bin Laden came from wealth and had opportunities that most people never receive. He was not driven to violence by poverty or desperation. His radicalization was intellectual and spiritual, or so he claimed, a response to perceived injustice rather than personal suffering. But there is always something more, something deeper, something in the human psyche that draws certain people toward destruction, that finds meaning in conflict, that cannot rest in peace but must always be at war. Perhaps bin Laden was such a person, and the specific causes he chose, the liberation of Palestine, the expulsion of foreign forces from Muslim lands, the overthrow of corrupt regimes, were the vehicles through which he expressed something more fundamental, a need to struggle, to oppose, to define himself through combat. By 2026, as we move forward into the near future, bin Laden would be 74 years old, an age at which mortality becomes not an abstraction but a daily presence, a reality felt in aching joints and diminished energy and the knowledge that time remaining is shorter than time past. If he has survived this long, evading the most sustained manhunt in modern history, evading drones and special forces and the enormous apparatus of Western intelligence, then he has beaten odds that seemed insurmountable. But survival, in his circumstances, is not the same as living. It is existence in confinement, in perpetual fear of discovery, in isolation from the world he sought to change. There are no friends at this point, only guards and handlers. There is no family, or if there is family, they are scattered, hidden, themselves targets of surveillance. His wives, his children, have lived under the weight of his choices, have been imprisoned, have been monitored, have struggled to build lives in the wreckage of his legacy. The world continues to change in ways that have nothing to do with him, in ways he cannot influence or control. Climate change accelerates, displacing populations, creating new categories of refugees, straining resources and exacerbating conflicts. Artificial intelligence advances toward capabilities that were science fiction when he was young, creating efficiencies and threats that reshape economics and warfare. The geopolitical balance shifts as China's power grows and American dominance wanes, not through sudden collapse but through gradual erosion, through the accumulation of debts and dysfunctions and the natural cycles of imperial rise and fall. In this landscape, terrorism is one threat among many, and bin Laden is one terrorist among thousands, distinguished only by the scale of the attack he orchestrated and the longevity of his evasion. He is famous, certainly, his name known globally, but fame without freedom, notoriety without power, is a hollow achievement, a Pyrrhic victory that satisfies only ego. If there is a lesson in his continued survival, it might be this, that history does not wait for individuals, that the grand narratives we tell ourselves about heroes and villains are often simpler than the reality, that people who commit atrocities are still people, complex and contradictory, capable of tenderness and brutality, of faith and self-deception. Bin Laden was a son, a brother, a husband, a father. He was also a mass murderer who planned the deaths of thousands and triggered conflicts that killed hundreds of thousands more. These things coexist, do not cancel each other out, do not resolve into a simple judgment. And his immortality in this timeline, his continued existence into old age, forces a reckoning with the man rather than the myth, with the human being who ages and weakens and faces the same mortality that we all face, no matter how much we try to transcend it through ideology or violence or fame. The question of justice remains unresolved. If he is captured, will there be a trial? Will he be executed, imprisoned for life, rendered to some black site to be interrogated without end? Or will he die in hiding, his body never found, leaving the world with rumors and uncertainty rather than closure? Each possibility carries its own weight, its own implications for how his story is remembered and interpreted. A trial would expose his thinking, would allow him to speak, would risk turning him into a martyr or a philosopher depending on how he presented himself. An execution would be swift but might satisfy some desire for retribution, while leaving others feeling that justice requires more than death. Life imprisonment would be slow, would allow him to age into irrelevance, would perhaps be the cruelest punishment for a man who sought significance above all else. And dying in hiding, never being found, would leave his fate ambiguous, would allow conspiracy theories to flourish, would deny the world the certainty of conclusion. As we imagine forward into 2027 and beyond, into years that have not yet happened but which we can speculate about based on the trajectories we observe, Bin Laden's continued existence becomes increasingly implausible, increasingly unlikely. Human bodies fail, and his body, subjected to years of stress and hiding and limited medical care, would be under enormous strain. But if he defies probability and continues, if he reaches 75, 80, 85, what then? Does he become a living relic, a reminder of an earlier era of conflict, a symbol of a war that has faded into history? Do younger generations even know who he is? Or does he become a footnote, a name in textbooks, someone their grandparents remember, but who has no immediate relevance to their lives? The September 11th attacks will be remembered for generations, will be studied and memorialized, will remain a dividing line in history between the world before and the world after. But Bin Laden himself, the individual, may fade from consciousness even while the consequences of his actions persist. There is a kind of haunting in this possibility, the idea that a person can change the world and then outlive their own significance, can watch themselves become irrelevant, can experience the dissolution of their own importance while still breathing, still thinking, still existing in some marginal space. It is a different kind of death, a death of influence and meaning while the body persists. And perhaps it is the most fitting punishment for a man who sought to be remembered, who orchestrated mass murder in part for the spectacle, for the attention, for the place in history. To live and be forgotten, to survive and be irrelevant, this is the fate that immortality and hiding offers. It is not glorious. It is not transcendent. It is merely existence, stretched out longer than it should have been, than it needed to be, than it was meant to be. The war on terror, as a framework, as an organizing principle for global politics, has already ended in many ways, has been replaced by concerns about great power competition, about pandemics, about climate disasters, about the disruptions of technology. But the infrastructure of that war, the surveillance systems, the security agencies, the legal frameworks that expanded executive power and curtailed privacy, these remain, these persist, these have been normalized into the everyday functioning of governments around the world. This is part of Bin Laden's legacy too. Not just the direct violence, but the ways in which societies changed themselves in response to that violence, the ways in which fear was instrumentalized, the ways in which freedoms were traded for the promise of security, the ways in which the exception became the rule. He wanted to provoke, and the provocation succeeded, but the result was not the collapse of his enemies, but their transformation into harder, colder, more paranoid versions of themselves. And he lives to see this. If he lives to witness the world he helped create through the choices he made and the violence he unleashed. There is no escape from consequence, no hiding from the ripples that spread outward from every action, every decision, every moment of choosing one path over another. September 11th was a choice, was a deliberate act planned and executed with full knowledge of the likely outcomes, and everything that followed, the invasions, the torture, the drone strikes, the refugee crises, the destabilization, all of it flows from that choice, is connected to it, is part of the same historical thread that began when 19 men boarded planes with the intention of crashing them into buildings. Bin Laden cannot undo that choice. He cannot take it back, cannot reverse the consequences, cannot restore the lives that were lost or heal the wounds that were opened. He can only continue, if he continues, bearing the weight of what he has done, isolated and aging and increasingly powerless as the world moves forward without waiting for his approval or understanding. And so the story does not end, because in this timeline, he has not died, has not reached the conclusion that seemed inevitable in Abbottabad in 2011. He persists. The world persists. The consequences persist. Time flows forward, carrying all of us with it, erasing nothing but adding new layers, new complexities, new conflicts and resolutions that build upon the foundations of what came before. Osama bin Laden, the man who planned September 11th, who declared war on the world's sole superpower, who hid in caves and compounds and evaded capture for decades, remains alive somewhere, in some room, in some circumstance we can only imagine. He is 73, 74, aging into obscurity, living a kind of death in life that denies him martyrdom and grants him only the burden of continued existence. The war on terror continues in altered forms. The ideologies he helped spread continue to inspire violence. The world he wounded continues to struggle with the trauma of that wound. And he watches, or does not watch, thinks or does not think, prays or does not pray, in the silence of rooms that have become his tomb while he still breathes. There is no resolution here, no final scene, no moment of catharsis or understanding. There is only the ongoing, the perpetual, the endless unfolding of consequences without conclusion. History does not have clean endings. People do not always receive justice or punishment in proportion to their actions. The universe is not structured to satisfy our need for narrative closure. It simply continues, indifferent to our desires for meaning or fairness or resolution. And in this continuing, in this refusal to grant the satisfaction of an ending, perhaps there is a deeper truth about the nature of violence and trauma and the choices that shape our world. They do not resolve. They do not finish. They echo forward through time, through generations, through the infinite ripples of cause and effect that connect every moment to every other moment. Bin Laden lives, in this timeline, but his life has become its own prison, its own punishment, its own endless confrontation with the consequences of choices made decades ago. And the world moves on, forgets, remembers, moves on again, while somewhere in the shadows, an old man waits for death that refuses to come, and history flows past him like water around a stone, wearing him down slowly, erasing him gradually, until all that remains is the memory of what he did, and the world that memory created, forever changed, forever scarred, forever carrying the weight of September 11th and all that followed, into a future that extends beyond any individual life, beyond any single story, into the endless continuation of human struggle and suffering and resilience, without end, without rest, without the mercy of conclusion.